like everything is in the background.
All right. Oops, a lot of microphones. Okay, I'm sorry again for the change in schedule, but I mean we can go 1 hour and a half. I think it should be fine. Hopefully you can resist. Hopefully I can resist. Today's our last class, so I need to, whatever I finish, that's it. If I don't finish something, I can't do it next time. So I'll try to cover at least everything that is important. A few of you have written to me with some clarifications. Apologies if I haven't replied yet, but give me a couple of days and I will get back to one of you. And from now until January, when the exams are starting, feel free to reach out, to email me. Give me a few days to reply. If after 10 days I haven't replied, feel free to write back. If I don't reply, it's just because it goes into a pile of emails. It's not because I don't care. So feel free. Don't be worried. You can follow up and say, just want to remind you that I sent you this a few days ago. Whenever you have a second, don't worry about that. So we're gonna pick up where we left off last week, and then we're gonna continue our conversation on some cross-cutting issues. Last week we talked about the climate challenge, and we saw, first of all, we talked a little bit about climate law and what are the obligations of states, and in particular, what is the interface between all of that and trade and investment. And the first question that we kind of looked at is to, what is the space that trade and investment law leave to countries, to pursue climate change mitigation policies. We looked a little bit at that. We saw some cases. And then we asked ourselves, okay, so are rules actually adequate to deal with this new challenge? We talked a little bit about trade, and then we stopped. Actually, one of you had a question precisely on how, it was you, I think, on, okay, so if there is this regulatory chill, if actually there is this, risk and this problem that countries are afraid of regulating for climate purposes, can't we have different rules that allow countries more space? So that's exactly an avenue that has been explored. One way, of course, is to rely, and I might have mentioned this, rely on tribunals and hope that we're going to have tribunals that have a good understanding of public international law and that can understand that states have to be able to regulate while at the same time protecting investors. But this, creates a lot of instability and lack of predictability. You're a government, you don't know who is going to be sitting on a tribunal in case of a dispute. Do you really want to risk it? So another avenue, which I personally, I'm a big fan of this specific avenue, because it's not that I don't trust tribunals or arbitrators at all, but it's also true that, arbitrators, they also need to apply the treaty provisions. So of course they can be creative, they can have evolutionary interpretations, but there's still a treaty provision that is really the basis of their interpretation. So, if the treaty says something that doesn't really allow to introduce climate considerations, how can they transform that provision? So, trying to modify, reform, have refined language, more granular provisions that can actually help arbitrators and guide them. And there are different ways in which this has happened. The easiest, also the softest, is this one. We saw this already. This is the SADC model BIT preamble. And here, if you remember, we saw this when I showed you the different types of preambles, and we talked about how, although preambles are not binding per se, they help arbitrators interpret other provisions, right? And this is a preamble I particularly like. It's my own preference, but they have this reference, for example, where is it? Here. Promote, encourage, and increase investment opportunities that enhance sustainable development. So there is this idea that the kind of investments we want to protect and promote is not just investment, but it's kind of a sustainable investment. So you have a preamble like this. It could be easier to have a preamble like this in a treaty because it's not binding. So you might, be able to agree on having this kind of language. It's not an actual obligation, but you're a tribunal. You might look at this while interpreting other norms, and so kind of give more policy space to countries. But again, tribunals can choose how to work with preamble. So it's a nice way. It's I think, politically not too difficult way, but it's also very soft. Other ways, and we see some examples here and there, very rare still, is to have more granular provisions when it comes to the standards themselves. Instead of saying fair and equitable treatment, non-discrimination in like circumstances, no expropriation, these very vague general provisions, we have more granular provisions. This is an example. So the CETA, which is the trade agreement between Canada and the EU, when it talks about expropriation, you have your very kind of basic regular formulation. This is a regular, expropriation provision, public purpose, due process, la da da. But remember how we talked about indirect expropriation, in particular regulatory expropriation. When a state regulates, for example, for the public interest, it might be interpreted as an indirect expropriation if it has an effect, which is tantamount, equivalent to expropriation. So what have they done? The EU and Canada, they added Annex 8A. So this paragraph shall be interpreted in accordance with this annex. Great, let's go to the annex. The only thing you have to look at is here, 3, when the impact of the non-discriminatory measures of a party that are designed and applied to protect legitimate public welfare objectives such as health, safety, and the environment do not constitute indirect expropriations. So, except in rare circumstances, but in general, when a country adopts a measure that is non-discriminatory and it is to protect legitimate public welfare objectives, and you have these are just examples, it is not to be considered an indirect expropriation. Now, when it's about introducing new norms, there's always two sides of the same coin, two sides of the story. On the one hand, yes, we add more language like this. It can be helpful because the tribunal might then say, the measure is not discriminatory, it's for protection of the environment or climate, so we do not consider it indirect expropriation. But the more words you add, the more each of those words is open to interpretation. What are these rare circumstances? When is the impact of the measure severe? So you might hear a counter argument that tells you, okay, great, but you are basically telling the tribunal, each of these terms, when is something manifestly excessive? So it's true that there is a risk. On the one hand, we add more information that should help tribunals, but the more words you put, the more each word, especially words like rare, severe, manifestly excessive, these are open to interpretation. So it can help, but it's not that it solves everything. Just for you to know. So you might even hear this counter argument. This is an example with expropriation. Another example here, investment protocol to the FCFTA, national treatment. We may have seen this already. I may have showed you this already, maybe. That you have your in-like circumstances, right? So you cannot discriminate when investors are in like circumstances. And here you have some criteria that have to be taken into account by the tribunal when determining if and to what extent two investors are in like circumstances. And for instance, from a climate change point of view, effects on the global commons. So you could, discriminate against some fossil fuel investments because of their impacts on the global commons, climate system. It's just a guidance, but I feel that a tribunal that completely disregards this, it's hard, no? You would have then to really explain why you did that in your award. So this can be helpful way. There is another, and we are going kind of from the softest, so words in the preamble, to a little bit more, kind of stronger formulation. But of course, the stronger we go, the harder it is to actually get that compromise in the negotiation. It's easy to convince your counterparty to have sustainable in the preamble. It's much harder to get more granular standards if the other party isn't interested. And the next step is even harder, which you find, this is a good example, the agreement between Australia and the UAE. They have completely excluded some fossil fuel investments from the protection of the treaty. In the definition of investment, rights conferred, excluding those for the exploration and exploitation of natural resources, which means hydrocarbons, such as oil, gas, does not include renewable energy resources. Very unique, but this is an example where they have excluded from the definition of investments that they consider harmful for the environment. Very interesting. This is just to give you an idea of different avenues that are there when it comes to treaty negotiations. There are different ways where you can try and increase the policy space of the state. Now, what happens though is that most of the disputes, I was looking at some figures the other day for something else, and the vast percentage of disputes still happen under old treaties. So these new formulations, you find them in models, so not really treaties, a few treaties, but very few, and most disputes actually happen under old treaties. And you also need to think back to what we discussed when we were looking at the nationality of the investor. Remember that how do you determine the nationality of the investor? It depends on the treaty, right? Many treaties use the criterion of the incorporation. Investors will treaty shop. So investors might also, if there is a new generation of treaties that are very, great for the state and that limit the protection for investors, an investor will look, where am I going to incorporate my company? So that the treaty that will apply to me is going to be one of the old, German-style treaty and not this. If I'm an oil, company and I want to operate in the UAE, I will not incorporate in Australia. I mean, of course, it would be very stupid, But this is just to give you an idea. So, and again, and this also will go a little bit in what we'll be discussing today, but you see there's a lot more exciting new provisions that happen in investment compared to trade. And that's because we have bilaterals in investments. In trade, you need to negotiate, especially when it comes to the WTO, you need 166 countries that agree. Very hard, nearly impossible. Just today, the General Council, we'll talk about this, but the ministerial conference is happening in a few months at the WTO. The General Council, remember, it's the meeting at ambassador level, is meeting yesterday and today, and just a few hours ago, they blocked again the adoption of the incorporation in Annex 4 of the plurilateral investment facilitation. It's a plurilateral. It only applies to a subset, actually quite a lot, 128. And 3 countries, which I can name, but fine, you can find this online, they are blocking, they don't want it. Even it's not going to apply to them. And we're going to talk about that, but this shows you that it's so hard multilaterally to get new rules, while if you're in a bilateral context, at some point you're going to find a compromise, if it's just the two of you. So it's not surprising that we have a lot more kind of, interesting developments in bilateral investment law rather than multilateral trade law. The last point that I want to make, just to kind of close our discussion on climate change, is just to tell you a couple of things about this landmark advisory opinion that was delivered by the International Court of Justice on July 23rd this summer. It's a very important opinion. It's an opinion, as you know, advisory opinions are not binding per se. right? But they are very powerful. A lot of things that are now customary law or are now even in treaties, they were initially put forward in advisory opinions. So, the hope is that this is going to be one of those advisory opinion. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, the process started actually in a university. It was a university in Vanuatu. A bunch of students thought that the ICJ should clarify what are states' obligations when it comes to climate change. They managed to get the Pacific Islands endorsement. They built a global coalition because unlike other tribunals, so unlike, for example, ITLOS or unlike the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where an individual country can ask for an advisory opinion, ICJ, because the ICJ is the judicial body of the UN, you need the General Assembly. So they needed to, push as many countries convince as many countries as possible that this was a good thing. And in the end, yes, the General Assembly unanimously, actually, it's the first time, I think, that a request of an advisory opinion, some countries were not very excited, but I think it was a unanimous request to the ICJ to deliver an advisory opinion on these two questions. So this is the body of law that the ICJ was supposed to look at, which is basically the universal international law. Everything, from human rights to UNCLOS to Paris Agreement to customary law. The two questions are, what are the obligations of states under international law when it comes to the protection of climate system, and what are the legal consequences of violations? I strongly recommend reading the opinion, even the short version, or listening. It is, considering that the ICJ has been very traditional, usually this is, it's an amazing advisory opinion. And again, if you're interested, you can come to our course on international environmental law in the spring, where we will dissect this opinion. But the one point that I want to show you now, which is going to be interesting to see what this will mean for investment and trade law, is this. At some point, when they're looking into the consequences of violations, they say failure of a state to take appropriate action to protect the climate system may constitute an internationally wrongful act. So if a state doesn't do enough to protect the climate system, this may be an internationally wrongful act, which may trigger state responsibility. And of all the possible things, they single out these activities as examples. Fossil fuel production, fossil fuel consumption, the granting of fossil fuels licenses and subsidies. It's an advisory opinion. This is not binding on anybody. It's going to have a lot of influence on litigation. So a lot of work for Law12 to do. That's our topic. But you have the ICJ that tells you that granting fossil fuel subsidies, granting fossil fuel licenses, fossil fuel extra, could be because it depends. If you're Nigeria and you depend on fossil fuels, of course, we can't expect this level of engagement. But it could be an internationally wrongful act. How is that going to play out if you have a dispute, an investment dispute, in a trade dispute? I don't know. But it is going to have a role. Countries may use it to justify why they are phasing out fossil fuels. Country may use this to justify why they're not giving more subsidies, why they stop giving licenses. And it was unanimous as well, all the judges. And there were a couple of judges, Cleveland, and I don't remember who else, that had a separate opinion where they doubled down on the importance. That's also a separate opinion that is worth reading on the importance of fossil fuels. This is really something that should be could potentially give rise to state responsibility. So I wanted to, to finish this part on climate on this note, which I see as a positive note, because this is, again, they didn't have to. It's one of those moments, where they didn't have to say this. But let's see what this is going to lead to. Because they just, listed these activities, which from a trade and an investment perspective, it's huge. So it is really going to be interesting to see how this is going to play out. Everything okay? All right, let's move to, and again, it's very much linked to what we've been talking on climate, but another issue that is, of course, it's been a roller coaster for the past 10 years, 5 years. This year has been like insane when it comes to the geopolitics, not just when it comes to trade and investment, of course, but in general, you will hear and see a lot of conversations about the crisis of multilateralism, the fact that states are not cooperating as they used to. And again, this is something that it's not just about trade and investment. I think it's especially evident when it comes to trade, in particular trade cooperation, in particular because of the very flamboyant behavior of some countries. But this is something that we see in general. I don't know if any of you is interested in plastics, but the plastics negotiations are another example of the failure of countries to come together. These are, of course, are difficult conversations, but if you look at how fast treaties were negotiated in the 90s, it's just a different time. It's a different time. The leadership has changed. A lot has changed. And again, when it comes to trade, economic matters, in particular trade, this is extremely clear. I think that a lot of the attention is placed on two countries, in particular, the US and China. The tensions between the two countries, we'll talk a little bit about those. The US in particular, they're making it very easy this year because the Trump administration has just been very vocal, very, very vocal, and they haven't shied away from what they think about the multilateral trading system, about multilateral cooperation, about what other countries are doing. We added a couple of things that are not, whatever we have been adding, it's nothing compulsory for the exam or anything, but we added, I think, the website. There's a website that Chad Bown, who's an economist who actually has a podcast, which if any of you is interested in trade, it's called Trade Talks. It's in the syllabus. It's a really cool podcast. He's very good. And he has a website that we have uploaded where he has been tracing everything that Trump has been doing, the Trump administration has been doing since January 20 when it comes to trade. It's a huge list. I'm just showing you just a couple of slides, but it starts here, and then tariffs on Canada, then hold on tariffs, then the tariffs are back, then China retaliates, then aluminum for everybody. So it's a roller coaster of this. It's really cool. If you look at the website, you can really follow, and you have all the links to the executive order. So if there's any trade nerd, enjoy. And we get up to today. I think I checked this a few days ago, with the deals with Switzerland, reducing tariffs. So it's been a roller coaster of unilateral actions, putting tariffs, reducing them. A lot of what has been happening is that, like with Switzerland, insane tariffs, we get to a deal on something, we reduce the tariffs a little bit. So tariffs have been also used as a way to get countries to the negotiating table, and it has worked so far. So again, a lot of attention is put on the US and on the Trump administration, but when we see the situation where we are today, it's not. This is just one piece of the puzzle. A lot of the measures, the big measures that the US has been introducing are actually bipartisan. A lot of the criticism, some of the measures that we're going to be talking today are Biden measures. They're not even Trump measures. A lot of the criticism to the WTO has always been bipartisan. So it's, the criticism to the dispute settlement. This was the Democrats, this was the Republicans. It was even under Obama, under everybody. I assigned you two pieces. One that I want to start from, which is this one, which is an op-ed that Jamison Greer, who is the US Trade Representative, published in the summer. And then there's another piece from Foreign Affairs, from Froman, he was USTR during the second Obama administration, so Democrat. And they're kind of similar, the approaches. We uploaded, I think, today. If you have time, take a look at it. Again, everything that we upload, that it's not in the syllabus, it's not for the exam. But it's quite interesting, and this shows you how things are happening right now. The US yesterday has published a document for the General Council that is happening with their view on the reform, which, it's not very hopeful, but it follows up on what Jameson Greer is saying. And when this piece came out, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of academics on LinkedIn were dissecting, criticizing the piece. Oh, it's not accurate. He's defining Bretton Woods in a way that is not correct. This is not how international law works. Great. We could spend hours pointing out all the, international law mistakes that Jameson Greer has made. But to me, what is important is that this is USTR. So who is sending the message? USTR is the part of the US government that defines, that develops, that implements international trade policy. It's the part of the US government that negotiates trade agreements. It's the part of the US government that represents the US at the WTO, that coordinates trade policy across federal agencies, that advises President and Congress on trade policy. So even if I don't agree with some of the things he says, it tells us what the US position is. It tells us how the US is going to act in the future. So it is important to engage with it. And some of the things that you find in this piece, and that's why I assigned the piece, because you can read it, it's short, it's an op-ed, and you might disagree with certain points, but there are some points that are not necessarily wrong. He talks about a new global economic order. He said we're entering a new global economic order. It could be true. This is why I started the whole class with you telling you the history. If I hadn't done so, and I started by saying, there's the WTO, here's what the agreements say, you might think, oh, that's what trade law is WTO, multilateralism. No. It used to be bilateral trade arrangements for centuries. Then in the 40s, we get multilateral. That's a revolution. It's a huge revolution going from bilateral deals to a multilateral system. Multilateral system that we saw it at the beginning, still very shallow. Shallow integration, because liberalizing trade in certain goods. Remember, agriculture is out, services are out, developing countries don't have a lot to do. In the 90s, deep integration, WTO, bam, the framework explodes, touches upon every single trade policy, another revolution. So it might be time for a new change. This is just to say that institutions and the way in which states cooperate can evolve over time. It has evolved over time. And the geopolitics have changed. We are not in the same situation that we were in the 1940s. I'm sorry, but half of the world was under colonization. China wasn't the power that it is today. India wasn't the power that it is today. Globalization wasn't even happening. So we can't necessarily expect a system that maybe made sense in the 40s or in the 90s to continue exactly the same, in exactly the same way. Now, the US solution, which you can see in the proposal, is we don't need the WTO, basically. Now, we can work on a different solution. We can think of a way to keep the WTO relevant, but acknowledging that the world has changed, that some things might need true reform. One of the points that the US is pressing on is the issue of developing countries. They have a specific agenda. They're thinking of one specific developing country. They don't care about the others. But if you think about it, we have this system where a country can decide, I am developing, therefore I benefit from special and differential treatment. And in that basket, you have countries that have entirely different economic, political, and social situations. So isn't it maybe worth it to revisit this system? These are not bad ideas of elements that we should think about. That's why I think that again, the piece is, although it's disruptive, it doesn't really acknowledge the role of the WTO, but it does flag a few things that it's worth thinking about.
I have a question. What was the excuse? Because we've seen that the United States made tariffs on any war because of the Article 20 national security and drugs. But what's the excuse, the legal excuse in this case of Switzerland? What he said about Switzerland? Because I see this trade deficit.
Yeah.
But legally, you cannot say that. That's the excuse for that.
You mean because it's not a national security issue?
Yeah.
But that's a big thing, and that's what's going to be, there you go. My next point is going to be exactly that. The US, and with the US, again, I don't want to, it's hard not to talk about the US because they are just so vocal, but it's not the only country that has been, behaving in a certain way, in a unilateral way, and they have been using national security a lot to justify, at least in the press, in the media. We will see in disputes, if there are disputes, national security. The thing that is quite interesting is that this concept of national security has been stretched to and expanded to cover things that traditionally are not national security. I don't know if that's what you were, because vulnerability of the supply chain, trade deficit, the whole issue on critical minerals, for example, and semiconductors, they are economic issues. This is about economic vulnerability. But they have been framed by governments as national security issues. So this is an interesting, and we will see some measures later, but this is an interesting phenomenon. Everything now is national security. And national security, which traditionally used to be about war, about military threats, about territorial integrity, now everything is national security. We don't have, our workers are losing their jobs, national security. Our supply chain is vulnerable, national security. Everything is national security. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing is to say it in the press. Another thing, if you have a WTO dispute, for example, will you be able to justify your measure, arguing that it's national security? Because that's what they want to do. But could you do it? Remember, this is the provision we have. We saw this when we looked at the different exceptions. We saw Article 20, and then we saw this. And we saw that, for a long time, nobody cared about Article 21. Nobody raised it. In particular, the one that, at some point was raised was this. Prevent the control. So allowing a country to justify a measure that violates the GATT because it is necessary for the protection of the country's essential security interests, in particular, 3, taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations. This is what national security is. And if you remember, just to kind of refresh our memories, we looked at this dispute, which is the dispute that kind of tells us a little bit how to interpret. Again, this is not like Article 20. Article 20, we have so many disputes that have really helped us understand the meaning and interpretation of the different words. For Article 21, and that's what's quite, on the one hand, is fascinating, on the other is a little bit worrisome, because if we start having disputes justified under Article 21, let's see how the panels are going to interpret. But this case where Russia had basically stopped the transit of certain goods from Ukraine because of emergency in international relations, they had relied on this provision. And what is interesting in this case, again, I'm kind of repeating a little bit what I already said a few weeks ago, is that until that time, the assumption and Russia's argument was that this provision is self-judging. It's the state that can decide if a measure falls under national security. It's not for a panel to judge. This is for the state to decide. And the panel, instead, told us, wait a second. The first thing you need to do is this. Is there a war? Is there an emergency in international relation, and has the measure been taken in this context? This is an objective situation that a judge can assess. So the panel told us that if this exists, it's not for the state to decide, it's for the panel to decide. In that specific case, they found that yes, there was an emergency, UN General Assembly had already declared that there were, a situation of armed conflict, countries that imposed economic sanctions, fine. But this is for the panel to assess. Then where the state has a little bit more freedom is here, to determine what is essential security, then it's up to the state. So in this context, we can imagine countries trying to put a lot of stuff in this idea of essential security, even though that's not how the measure had been thought. The drafters didn't think about vulnerabilities in the supply chain of semiconductors. They were thinking of wars. But a country, the US, for example, or China, may play with this, essential security. But you need to prove that there's this. Political or economic differences, that's not an emergency. The panel was very clear. So, to what extent this is happening in certain relations, if you have a relation US-Russia, maybe, but US-China, tough, huh? So, but it will be interesting. This article that for many years was irrelevant almost is now becoming a very exciting article. And so, because again, many countries, and the US and China are the best examples, but they're not the only ones, are justifying all their measures, all their tariffs, everything with national security. This is new. This is new. So, and again, this is not just Trump. Huh? I don't know if you remember, but one of the last things that Biden did, besides pardoning his son, was this one, blocking, the purchase of U.S. steel by Nippon Steel, and he explained it. Where is it? Somewhere it says that it's national security. Here. Threat to national security. Now, the U.S. has a whole commission, that has a mandate to review foreign takeovers of American companies when there is a possibility of a threat to national security. And if they don't decide within a certain amount of time, it's up to the president. But for example, this was national security. Really? Because they buy a steel company? Wow. Same with Trump. This is, I had like hundreds to choose from. But keeping with steel, February 10, tariffs on steel, again, where is it? National security. The justification was always the same, but the best for the Trump administration has been using this. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which is an act from 1962, which allows to reduce imports and reduce trade for when the imports threaten national security. And almost everything has been put under this basket. So almost, if not every single tariff that the Trump administration has introduced was based on Section 232. Threat to national security, threat to national security, threat to national security, when usually the threat is to the economy, really. And we'll see some examples. And this is kind of the point. Are these measures really there for economic security, or is it national security? And has it now become the same thing? This is what some of these countries are trying to do. They're trying to say that all these issues that normally were economic vulnerability, economic security issues are now national security. And again, countries can say whatever they want in the press. It will be interesting to see how judges will look at those. But this is something very big. The lines between the two concepts are getting more and more blurry. And this gives, brings to another point, to the fact that a lot of countries are now using, and we'll see examples, but they're using trade policy and economic tools as basically as economic weapons to strengthen their own economy and to harm the economy of other countries that they see as enemies. And actually, I was thinking, we can do it later. No one. This is from the article from Froman that I assigned you is from this issue of Foreign Affairs, which is called The Weaponized World Economy. We can upload the whole issue. Again, not for the exam, but there are a lot of interesting articles, all looking at a little bit the topics that we're talking about today. So the different, ways in which countries are weaponizing trade policy, and we can put the whole issue up as a holiday reading. Now, I want to focus in particular on two sectors or two products or categories of products where a lot of these tensions have been. In particular, again, the big umbrella is US-China, but other countries are also involved. The first one is critical minerals and rare earths, and the second is semiconductors. Critical minerals and rare earths, where do we find them? What are they? Like going back to your high school studies. Periodic table. So critical minerals is, of course, you don't have to know this. I don't even know this. But the critical minerals is broader. So rare earths are a subset of critical minerals. The blue are the rare earths. So it's this line and these three. And then these together with the gray ones, those are critical minerals. But what matters is how do we use them? They are used in, and this is not even a full list, but they are critical for the energy transition, from wind turbines, you don't have this here, battery for electric vehicles. They are critical for defense, right? For military manufacturing, from satellites, guidance systems, lasers, cars. This would not be possible without rare earths. You wouldn't be able to have something so small to have sound, and even this. Rare earths, okay? So in your everyday life, everything is powered by rare earths, and there are a lot of critical sectors. Again, defense, transition, ceramics. Ceramics, those are the base for chips, for semiconductors. So these are really critical, and what's interesting is, where do we find them? Now, most of them are found in China. This doesn't even give you the whole picture, because it's even the role that China has in when it comes to critical minerals and rare earths is even more if we think about where processing happens and the ownership of the firms that are involved in manufacturing. Even outside of China, it's often Chinese-owned firms. So, and for some types, specific types of rare earths, it's more than 90% are found just in one country. Now, this is not a new issue. This is not a new issue, and the link between trade policy, trade restrictions, and rare earths is not new. These are two disputes. That one was brought in 2009 and the other one in 2012. I was actually living in China when these disputes were happening. It was an exciting time. And these were disputes that were brought against China to the WTO because of export restrictions that China imposed on critical raw materials and rare earths. And these are both quantitative restrictions, which are, as you know, prohibited by Article 11, remember? Export quotas, export licensing, and also the accession protocol, because they also had export tariffs. Now, export tariffs are not prohibited or regulated under the GATT, but some WTO members that have joined afterwards have rules on export tariffs in their protocols of accession. China, Russia. So there was a bunch of different rules that China had violated. So the main one, let's say, was, again, Protocol of Accession and Article 11. China tried to justify, at the time, with Article 20, that you know very well by now. General exceptions. China had two key arguments. The first one was dismissed very, very quickly. The first argument was the sovereignty argument. They said, well, you know, the GATT, first of all, the GATT and WTO law apply to resources like minerals once they're out. Once they're in the ground, a country can do whatever they want. They're sovereign over their natural resources. So if a country decides to keep oil in the ground, to keep rare earths in the ground, they're sovereign. It's up to them. You pull them out of the ground, they become tradable commodities. That's when WTO law kicks in. Their first argument was a sovereignty argument, saying we are sovereign over natural resources, permanent sovereignty, we should be able to decide. Well, you know what? You join the WTO, you relinquish part of your sovereignty. So yeah, you still need to comply with the rules. But the main argument was an environmental protection argument. They were arguing, you know, extraction of raw materials and rare earths pollutes, causes damage to the environment. True, because it causes very significant damage to the local environment. And so they were trying to justify the measure under B and under G, in particular G. But you see, G, it tells you that to conserve natural resources, if the measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production and consumption. Now, if we go back 1 second to our beloved US shrimp case, the US had restricted, yes, imports of shrimp, but they also had imposed on their own fishermen the duty to use a certain device. So there was a, you know, the same treatment had been imposed domestically. So that was okay. China continued producing the same amount. They just limit exports. So if you really care about protecting the local environment, you don't extract. Because what damages the environment is extracting, not selling. What was the real reason? The real reason is we have 90% of these amazing things. We keep them in-house. So our manufacturers of wind turbines, of telephones, of satellites, they can buy them cheaply because there's a lot of them. We limit export. So there's going to be very few of these minerals in the market. Foreign companies will have to pay a high price. So it's a way to protect and help your own industry. When you restrict exports on raw materials, often you do it because you want to help your industry that use that raw material. So they lost. Both cases. But this didn't stop them. They kept introducing export controls on raw materials, on critical minerals. In 2016, if I'm not mistaken, under the Obama administration, they started consultation to bring a new dispute to the WTO. It was just 2015. It was just before Trump came into power for the first time, and then the Trump administration decided not to pursue because they never had a lot of faith in the WTO. But you know, the export controls have continued, and to give you a sense of what's happening now, so I can take a little break, I want to show you this. The volume is up.
Jia Ying's colourful store in South Beijing is easy to spot from a distance. For 10 years, she sold LED lights to customers all over China and abroad.
All our materials are sourced from China and assembled in China. This gives us a huge advantage over the products of our foreign counterparts.
Those materials include rare earths, a core component of LED lights. Beijing's restrictions on their export are now at the center of China's trade tensions with the United States.
Without rare earth, these lights would not be as bright, colourful, or energy efficient. And it's not just LED lights that use them. From smartphones to headphones, many everyday electrical appliances rely on rare earths.
China has dominated the global supply since the 1990s. It mines 70% of the world's rare earths and accounts for 90% of their refinement, a costly and environmentally damaging process. Control of the sector has bolstered Chinese manufacturing, and it's also crucial for making weapons, including missiles and fighter jets. Beijing's rationale for curbing supply.
They're not saying you can't have any, they're saying you have to license. And by the way, we're not going to allow you to have rare earths to make weapons to threaten us with or to use against us.
New controls announced on October 9 force companies outside of China to detail how the rare earths will be used before they are given approval to purchase them. The Trump administration described the move as extreme, threatening an added 100% tariff if not reversed. Analysts say Beijing is responding to Washington's heightened restrictions on advanced chips.
The rare earth export control from China in the Chinese context is not seen as an escalation. It's a equal response to the escalation from the US.
In recent weeks, US President Donald Trump has scrambled to broker deals with other countries, including Australia and Japan, seeking alternative rare earth supplies. But analysts say it will take years to replace China's reserves. Katrina Yoon, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al
Another
Jazeera
time the full
Reliable
picture.
News, expert insight.
So this is happening right now, and you can see that the different points of view, right? You have again these export controls, and the first interviewee mentions it doesn't mean that we are not selling them abroad, but you have to license. Export licensing is one type of export restriction, of quantitative restriction. It's a response to the US. There has been, and we will see in a second, but there has been this back and forth between China and the US with, on the one hand, China controlling exports on critical minerals, on the other hand, the US trying to preserve semiconductors. So there is a lot not giving China chips to develop their own semiconductor industry. So who came first, the egg or the chicken? I don't know how that phrase goes, something like that. Who started it? I don't know. But there is this increasing tension, and countries are reacting in many different ways. The US is reacting in those two ways that you saw: tariffs, so big tariffs. They're reacting by trying to push and incentivize other countries to produce this kind of materials. For instance, the Inflation Reduction Act that was introduced under the previous administration has subsidies for electric vehicles, but you need to buy your batteries from a battery manufacturer that doesn't source critical minerals from China. So there are all these little requirements trying to harm Chinese production of critical minerals and incentivize, because they're not the only ones. Other countries produce critical minerals. The EU also has introduced a couple of years ago a regulation on critical minerals where they're again trying to diversify the supply. For instance, at each stage of the manufacturing process in certain strategic industries, no more than 65% of critical minerals can come from the same country. The idea is we can't be too dependent on one country, because then if they put export controls, we are, in a difficult situation, let's say. Another interesting response of the US has been to find deals with others. Japan, Australia, Thailand, a couple of other South Asian countries. These are not real treaties. These are soft soft law instruments, let's say, but they're trying to find deals with other countries to make sure that they can diversify and commit with each other to source their critical minerals elsewhere. To what extent are you protecting national security? Are you trying to, have a negative impact on the Chinese economy? So again, this is where this national security, economic security becomes a little bit problematic. And the other side, because these are interrelated, because as you saw, critical minerals are needed for chips, for semiconductors, and that's another industry which from a geographic point of view is even more crazy, and that's semiconductors. Semiconductors are, they're needed for anything. I think that our everyday life can function without chips, without semiconductors, from power grids to smartphones. Almost every single, manufacturing industry relies on semiconductors, right? As advanced as possible, in particular, corporate computing, defense. There's a lot when it comes to military applications. They rely on semiconductors. And semiconductors were, I think a few years ago, in 2022, it was the most traded good in the world. Like 15% or something of all trade was semiconductors. And who produces semiconductors? It's just a handful of countries in Asia. The main producer is Taiwan. You stop here, this is forecast. If you stop here, you see the main producer is Taiwan. Then you have South Korea, China, Japan. Taiwan produces more than 60% of all chips. More than 90% of all advanced chips. US tech industries source 90% of their chips from one company, TSMC, which is a Taiwanese company. One single company from one single country. This is risky. For a lot of countries, they consider this very risky, very dangerous. What if something happens in that small region of the world? During COVID, there was, big shortage of chips. Problems in the manufacturing industry all over the world. Lots of people lost their jobs because of loss of manufacturing jobs because they didn't have chips. In 2024, there was an earthquake in Taiwan. Shortage of chips. But the big fear, what do you think the big fear is? There, it's always there. China. What if China invades Taiwan? Or even what if there's a war in Taiwan? This is fear number one. Fear number two is that even without invading Taiwan, China would surpass Taiwan, and that's kind of the forecast. And this is a little bit, this is the part of the US narrative that, the US was a big promoter of globalization. This is a product of globalization. You open markets, you have your companies. US companies were in China, helping the country develop. And, of course, that's the promise of globalization, right? That you're going to grow in your manufacturing industry. And China has, with the 5-year plans, they have very clear strategies. In 2014, they had the Made in China 2025 industrial strategy. Powerful strategy. They picked all the important sectors, visionaries, and they invested heavily. One of them was semiconductors. So the other fear is that, again, for the US and a few other countries, what if China becomes the main producer of advanced chips, and then maybe they put export controls or things like that? So that's the other big fear. So countries, in particular the US, but not only, have tried to other countries as well, but they have tried to, adopt measures to avoid these risks. And so are they national security measures? You fearing that China might become the main producer, is that a national security measure? If there is the issue of chips used in weapons, that's another, but not wanting another country to, become a bigger producer than you, I don't see that necessarily as national security. But what was the US response to this? A few responses, tariffs, of course, that's the easy one. So tariffs on semiconductors from China. What's the goal of these tariffs? Trying to incentivize domestic production, because the US is not doing bad, it's not doing great, but, and trying to also incentivize production of chips, advanced chips in particular, that are produced in other countries. So you block tariffs from China, you help other countries to gain market shares in the US. And the other very important piece of the US strategy was the Chips and Science Act. This is Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. So this is it's a Biden act. This also gives you an idea that, again, that when it comes to the US, a lot of things have been happening for a long time. Even many of the tariffs that Trump introduced in Trump 1, Biden left them there, didn't remove them. So she's struggling with something, I'm not sure what, but she's signing that the Chips and Science Act, and this from 2022, and there, this act was the result of a study that had been done by the White House, all based on national security. Semiconductors become increasingly embedded and essential technologies, because it's true, you need them everywhere. Secure supply chains are important to economic and national security, so we put them together, as if it's the same thing. I'm sorry, but technologies throughout the economy, secure supply chain, this historically is not a national security issue. This is an economic security issue. But as you can see, everything is framed as national security. Because if you frame things as national security, you can do things. Everything that I told you that Trump has done, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, requires national security. So you have to frame these measures as national security, otherwise he doesn't have the power to adopt those measures. And here again, the United States relies on sources, Taiwan, South Korea, China. This is fundamental for future national security and infrastructure needs. So this report framed the whole issue of chips and semiconductors as a national security issue, and the result was the Chips and Science Act, which, first of all, it's a big subsidy scheme. That's the main thing. It's a huge subsidy scheme to subsidize US production of chips and advanced chips. The difference between this scheme and, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act or other subsidies is that this is entirely based on national security grounds. But there are some interesting elements in it. There is something called the National Security Guardrail within, as a kind of a parallel program, whereby if you are a recipient of a subsidy, you cannot acquire Chinese entities, and you cannot engage in any relationship, whether it's research, whether it's anything with the Chinese entity. National security. So this kind of provisions and measures is what lead us to say this is kind of, you're using economic measures to alter geopolitical relations, to alter the balance of powers. This is not just about your supply chain. You are also trying to undermine an industry in another country because you don't want the geopolitics to change. That's why we talk about the weaponization. National security, it's not just about trade. There's also something that is happening more and more, which is investment screening. A lot of countries are doing that. There's more than 30 countries. I think UNCTAD has done a study on it. And there's more than 30 countries today, mostly in Europe, that are adopting investment screening laws. It's been increasing over time. So these are basically laws where you screen. You have a foreign investment, you screen to what extent you want it or not. Usually, these are the main words that come out as justification for investment screening. It's mostly, security, national security, national security. It's really mostly national security. It's a lot in strategic sectors, critical minerals, semiconductors. An investor is coming, I screen to make sure that it's not gonna gain, by entering into my territory, into my market, it might gain technology, know-how, understand how my technology works. I wanna avoid that. I wanna protect my industry in these very advanced, sectors and sectors that are critical for the economy. So they screen. Now we go back to something that maybe when I talked to you about, it didn't seem super interesting, but now it becomes kind of exciting. Are countries allowed to do this? Can a country decide which investors they want to have on their territory? In general, what do you think? Yes. Switzerland doesn't allow foreign investors in the hydropower sector. Investment law kicks in when the investors are there, right? So in theory, a country is allowed to say, I don't want foreign investors in this sector. But some BITs give a little bit more protection to investors. When we talked about non-discrimination, I showed you, we compared the German model and the US model. Mostly we compared the fact that the German model doesn't have a comparison. You cannot discriminate, you cannot treat foreign investors less favorably than domestic, or than other foreign investors. And instead, the US model has in-like circumstances. That was our focus, right? But there is another difference, which I briefly mentioned at the time. The US model lists all the activities, all the moments of the investment that are protected. And establishment, acquisition, these are pre-entry activities. Even before I have established myself, before I have acquired an asset, I cannot be discriminated against. This is where the difference comes in. You have this BIT, you have a law that does invest, or you screen investments, you don't let me in, but you let someone else in. What's up? You need to protect me before entry. It's very rare, huh? It's rare to have treaties that list the moments, but that's when this distinction can become interesting today. Screening can be problematic if your BIT looks like this. Now, to complicate things further, your BIT may look like this, but you also may have this, which is an exception for essential security. We didn't talk about this in class, and I don't expect you to know this because we did not talk about this, but investment treaties, not all of them, some of them have exception clauses that sometimes are kind of copied and pasted from the GATT. No need to remember that we have exception clauses necessarily. We didn't look at them. I didn't show you any. But this is just to show you that the US model BIT does have an exception for essential security, which means that you are the US, you have a treaty that looks like this, you screen an investor, like a Chinese investor, or an investor because it's investing in your critical minerals, whatever. An investor could argue that you are discriminating and that the pre-entry applies still, you can try to justify by saying that you're doing that to protect your essential security. So there is a way out. Just saying that if you ever work in this business, even if you have a provision of non-discrimination that covers both pre-entry and post-entry, if you're lucky, you also have an exception clause like this, which you can use. Last thing I want to talk to you about, we have 12 minutes, is alternatives to multilateralism. And this goes, again, if you have a look at the document that the US has published yesterday, they start by basically saying that the WTO no longer make sense as a negotiating forum from a multilateral point of view. This is not entirely wrong, the multilateral point of view, in the sense that you need to have 166 members agreeing. Consensus. Remember always, single undertaking and consensus. Consensus makes sense. Under international law, you cannot bind a state with a treaty that the state has not accepted. This is unthinkable in international law, right? And it's true that it's going to be very hard to come up with multilateral rules at the WTO. Again, the geopolitical context is different. We have 166 countries that have completely different priorities, interests, and coming up with a set of rules where they all agree, I find it impossible, frankly. But the WTO also allows for plurilateral agreements. Annex 4, plurilateral agreements. These are agreements that a subset of members can agree upon, and they only bind those members. The tricky part is that, yes, you can have, 40 members that negotiate an agreement, great. Only those 40 members are going to be bound by that agreement, but to be incorporated here in Annex 4, you need consensus. That's what I told you at the very beginning. I told you that 3 countries are blocking the incorporation here of the investment facilitation agreement. These are 3 countries that have not negotiated. They would not be bound by that agreement, but they're still blocking it. Why are they blocking it? Why countries oppose plurilaterals? It can be for many different reasons. It can be because they deeply believe that the WTO should just be multilateral. It can be that they think that if a lot of countries are in a plurilateral, there might be spillovers, that they might end up to have to change something because there are going to be spillovers in their own economies. Or they might just be obstructionist for political reasons. I'm not going to say what I think is happening. But, and the first part of the US memo says precisely this. The US believes, the US, for example, has not, if I'm not mistaken, they have not negotiated or ratified the investment facilitation, but they are accepting that it's approved, that it's incorporated. And I do agree that plurilaterals within the WTO is kind of the only way to keep the WTO as a negotiating forum. Because we can try multilateral, but it's probably never going to happen. Plurilaterals, you can start small, and then countries can join, and they can join very easily. And there's a history. This is a whole history of different. Some of them are no longer in force. Some of them, these on services, they work differently. They go into the schedules. We didn't talk about services, so you don't need to know this, but it's a different story. But the ones on products, like the ITA or the government procurement, for example, they have to be approved by the whole membership. So they have been, traditionally there have been plurilaterals. This is not something new. And they can be on an MFN basis or on a non-MFN basis. MFN basis, for instance, the ITA, it means that 82 countries negotiate, but we decide to apply MFN. We extend all the benefits to everyone else. So the others don't have to do anything, but they get the benefits. Why do they do that? Well, because they don't want to be blocked. In the case of the ITA, you have 82 countries. They represent around 96% of the trade in products that are covered by the ITA. So who cares? The free riders are 4%. Fine, let's have them. Let's have them have the benefits. So in a situation like this, where you have a critical mass that is part of the treaty, you can do MFN. It's not a big deal. The free riders are just a couple of small countries that don't really trade much. And it's an incentive for everyone to say, of course, let's adopt it. The government procurement, it's not applied on MFN because it's only 48 countries and they don't cover a lot of the trade. So it was a little bit more sensitive. They didn't want to give the benefits to a lot of other countries that didn't participate. But it was approved because, again, some voices that in the 1990s were not strong now are strong. If you look at the countries that are blocking the plurilaterals today, you wouldn't hear their voices in the 1990s, but you hear their voices today. So the world has changed. Now, plurilaterals are not the only possibility within the WTO. Countries, we saw this many weeks ago, they can also do free trade agreements outside. What I'm saying is that to those countries that are blocking these plurilaterals, that doesn't mean that countries won't negotiate agreements between them, but they will do it outside of the WTO if they're interested. And if they do it outside of the WTO, if one day you want to join, well, you need to negotiate accession to that treaty. While here, it's easy. Okay, These are some initiatives that are, some are already, these one are out. But these are initiatives that are still, frankly, trade and gender, I don't know what they're doing. But these other initiatives are quite, yes, these are all up and running. There are informal discussions, informal working groups. These are all, these tables are from a piece that I assigned, which is excellent, from James Backus, that some of you had as a professor, I think, who, by the way, was on that lead body from the shrimp case. These are all initiatives that could potentially one day become plurilaterals because they cover kind of hot topics. But again, we need to have the political, will to accept that plurilaterals are something that happens at the WTO. Because as I said, your alternative is the spaghetti bowl of more and more and even more free trade agreements. We have more than 400 free trade agreements, and those are just those that, that there's a bunch of them that are notified to the WTO, but, the AFCFTA has never been notified to the WTO. It's a Africa Continental Free Trade Area. They haven't notified. They don't exist for the WTO. And then, God knows what was going to happen next. You might have free trade agreements on critical minerals, on specific issues. We don't know what is going to be the future, but if we don't allow countries to negotiate in smaller groups, in smaller clubs within the WTO, they will keep doing it outside. And you have a lot of examples now. There's a lot of different bilateral groups, regions, countries that don't seem to have anything in common that somehow get together with these negotiations. How is everything? Is everything good? All right. Let me use these last 3 minutes to thank you. It's really been a pleasure. I have to say, I was telling Nolan that I have a lot of fun, and I'm always happy to come and talk to you. I know that this was not an easy class. It's not easy. Having especially these different trade and investments, although are part of international economic law, they are two different universes. They function differently. And having to move from one to the other and now back to both, I know that this is not an easy class. I have thrown an insane amount of information at you. I hope that you will have time now to enjoy your break, but also to kind of digest all of these things. Feel free to reach out, you know, if at some point you're panicking, you realize you didn't understand something, or for anything, before the exam start. When the exam starts, that's it. But before, feel free. I really, I know, some of you have come to see me, and you know that I don't mind spending time and going over some of the issues, or answering by email if you prefer, whatever you like. But please feel free. If you still want to switch for the exam, continue writing to us. There have been very little. I was expecting like a whole Tetris, and instead you have liked your exam date. Very good. We will also we will have a session, not the 14th, but at some point we should set a date in January, like a Zoom meeting. So it's not compulsory. Show up if you're interested. I won't prepare anything. So, I will start the meeting. If there's someone with questions, I will address those questions. So even if you don't have questions, but you might be interested in other people, then use the forum that we set up if you want. And good luck. Good luck in the preparation. Please study hard, because I wanna give good grades. But most thank you again, and you deserve a holiday, so enjoy your holiday, and I will see you in the new year.